If it's Thursday, President Biden is kicking off a historic campaign fundraiser right now. With Presidents Obama and Clinton, Biden is raking in the cash, but still behind Trump in the polls. Plus, new details in the investigation into what happened in the moments before a massive cargo ship crashed into the Francis Scott Key Bridge, as crews are now beginning the long process of clearing the disaster site, and Baltimore pauses to mourn the victims. And former crypto mogul Sam Bankman-Fried is sentenced to a quarter century in federal prison for masterminding one of the largest financial fraud schemes in U.S. history. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamiche Alcindor, reporting in Washington. Today, the center of the Democratic political universe is in Midtown Manhattan, specifically Radio City Music Hall. That is where President Biden will soon take the stage with the two most recent Democratic presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, in a historic show of Democratic force. The event is featuring a number of celebrities, from Lizzo to Steve Colbert, and is expected to raise $25 million. To put that into perspective, that's more than both the Biden and Trump campaigns raised in the entire month of February. And it will further increase the Biden campaign's cash advantage over Trump. But the event will also highlight one of President Biden's most significant liabilities, his age. At 81 years old, Biden is older than both former presidents Clinton and Obama. Sources tell NBC News President Biden has remained in close contact with the former presidents. But Biden is even trying to use a twist on a campaign line from Clinton, answering question about his opponent Bob Dole's age.
My fellow Americans, the issue facing our nation isn't how old we are, it's how old are our ideas.
I can only tell you that I don't think Senator Dole is too old to be president. It's the age of his ideas that I question.
But while tonight's big event highlights some of Biden's key advantages, he is still narrowly behind Trump in the polls. A Fox News poll last night has Biden down 5 points to the former president, though that is still within the margin of error. While Biden has seen a slight bump in some other polls since his State of the Union address, he still trails the former president by a small margin. That Fox News poll also had President Biden's favorable numbers at 39% compared to Donald Trump's 45%. So right now we've got one candidate with a slight deficit in the polls and a big cash advantage, and another facing a cash crunch while slightly ahead in the polls. And it's 221 days until Election Day. NBC's Gabe Gutierrez is across the street from Radio City Music Hall at NBC News headquarters, Rockefeller Center. So Gabe, take us inside tonight's event. What do we expect?
Hi there, Yamiche. Well, the security situation is really ramping up, of course. 3 former presidents, as you mentioned, and it's expected to be a star-studded event. As you laid out, Lizzo, Queen Latifah. The Biden campaign is really trying to, say that this is a huge fundraising event, first of its kind, and as you said, more than $25 million expected to be raised, and about 5,000 people. Of course, Yamiche, that will also mean that there will likely be protesters here. The NYPD will block off many streets around Radio City Music Hall, that iconic venue that you're looking at right now. But there's also a large protest scheduled for nearby Bryant Park as well. That's something that police are looking for as well. You see the video right there earlier today, President Biden and former President Obama walking side by side off of Air Force One. And this is the image that the Biden campaign really wants to highlight, Yamiche.
And, Gabe, it is striking to see all these presidents together. We, of course, know that President Biden is older than both of these presidents. So I wonder, when you think about the fact that President Biden is now getting together with them, what's he hoping to learn from them, especially because, of course, they both won their re-election bids?
Sure. Well, we understand from NBC's reporting that, President Biden consistently stays in touch with former Presidents Obama and Clinton. Then in some cases, after they have private conversation, he directs his aides to, follow up on some finer points. So just a few days ago, former President Obama and President Biden recorded a video, talking up the Affordable Care Act. And this is something that we can expect in the coming months. Former President Obama, of course, like many Democrats, has been concerned, aides say, of what's at stake in this election and the possibility that former President Trump could be back in the White House. And we've really been seeing him now in the last few weeks, and over the coming months, we expect him to take an increasingly active role in the campaign, Yamiche.
Definitely going to be interesting to watch them take an active role. We have to say it over and over again, $25 million is how much they expect to raise today. When you think about that, though, I think about the idea that former President Trump, when he won in 2016, he didn't have the most money out of the candidates that he was able to best out. So how is the Biden campaign looking at this?
Well, look, and it is still early in the campaign. Yamiche, you cover them as well. And what they constantly say is that they really are looking forward to this part of the campaign late in the next couple of months when people really start tuning in to this election. They think that everything prior to this has been a lot of noise. However, they are very quick to highlight their huge fundraising advantage at this point. They also tell me, according to one source familiar with the fundraising, that a good portion of this is actually from small dollar donors. Of course, there could be some criticism today with former President Trump heading nearby to Long Island to visit the sort of counter programming, essentially visiting the wake of a fallen NYPD officer. President Biden, will be seen with celebrities here at Radio City Music Hall. Some of his critics saying that, he's focusing on that instead of other priorities. But again, this is trying to get the excitement for this campaign, trying to show that the Biden campaign can raise this money and really kicking off this general election season following the State of the Union, Yamiche.
Well, certainly a lot to watch out for there in New York. So thank you, Gabe, for joining us. And joining me now is Democratic Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. He is the chair of the Democratic Governors Association and is supporting President Biden's reelection campaign. Thank you so much for being here, Governor.
Pleasure to be with you.
So we know, of course, that this is going to be a big fundraiser. The Biden campaign is even calling this what they believe to be the most successful political fundraiser in history. That being said, what's the significance of today in this event beyond the money?
Yeah, well, it's what the money can do. And we saw it out here in Minnesota, of course, a purple state out here. This race will be won in the Midwest from here to Wisconsin, Michigan, over to Pennsylvania. And what it meant is three major operatives were hired out here. A campaign team is out here. We see the structure being put in place. What this money does, it translates into the folks who will be out there to knock on the doors, to get out the vote, to make sure that we're getting the numbers necessary. And that's exactly how you win these campaigns. People aren't paying attention yet. This is preparing for November, and this money and this kind of enthusiasm around it will translate into real votes. So I'm really excited about it. I think it shows they're taking it very seriously. It shows that enthusiasm gap will start to close as people recognize, look, this is a president who's delivered 15 million jobs, got us out of the mess of COVID that Donald Trump left us in, and they'll start being reminded that while this president's out there doing the work of rebuilding roads and bridges, the former president's in court trying to deal with his mess. So I'm excited about it. I'm excited about the event. I wish I'd be there.
Well, I have to ask you, when you think about the fact that both Presidents Obama and President Clinton, they both were able to win their reelection bids, what do you think President Biden could learn from them when you think about the fact that he, of course, is now trying to do what they did?
Yeah, I think it's organization. I do think it's being serious about this, having been around for especially President Obama's second run. I was a member of Congress at that time, and I watched. If you recall, he was behind. His numbers weren't much higher than this. The polls had him done early in that, and of course, that's not the way it worked out, and we all won again. I think it's staying focused on the fundamentals. Vice President Harris was out here a couple weeks ago, was at a Planned Parenthood clinic, stopped at a high school softball game. They're starting to get that retail politicking goes. And look, the contrast between your revenge tour and the angry rants coming from Donald Trump versus this positive vision of what we can do, I think that's what they should listen to. I think they're doing it. I think President Obama's reelection prove that you don't have to look early on what the polls are. That's not an indication of where we'll end. So I'm feeling confident. And look, President Trump now taking and using any money they're raising, which is far less than this, and putting it towards his legal funds. The Republican Party in Minnesota has $52 in the bank. They have less in Michigan. Those are real liabilities when it comes time to a campaign, and I just don't see how they're going to turn that on a dime. So I'm excited about it.
And Governor, you bring up former President Trump. We know, at least according to the polls, which are still in the margin of error, that President Biden is behind Trump, it seems, in a number of polls. Is the money enough to close that gap, the money that the Biden campaign is raising here?
Well, it's part of it. The other part will be is that people will be reminded what a disaster Donald Trump left us on. I was there when he was telling us infrastructure week every other day was going to be that. President Biden was just out here delivering $1 billion for a major bridge in northern Minnesota. So it's a combination of the money allows us to tell the story. This becomes the binary choice about our future of hopefulness, rebuilding, an inclusive place, reproductive rights being something that's protected, the ACA and affordable health care. That is all opposite if it's a Donald Trump presidency. And I think what starts to happen is now, this is somewhat at this time kind of a referendum on the frustration people feel. And while America's economy is better than any other one, prices are still up. So there's kind of a general malaise that gets attached to the president. But once the choice becomes clear and once we start to move into all of the positives that have been done, it'll clarify itself. So I'm confident we'll reelect President Biden and we'll have a much more positive outlook on things as we get closer to the election.
And you talk about the economy. This Fox News poll yesterday, about 20% of people said the economy is the president's biggest accomplishment, but about the same number of people said it's also his biggest failure. So how could the president square that? How can he get Americans feeling good about the economy, even if they see the numbers, but they don't think that they're feeling that?
Yeah, and they might not. I said, look, we're coming up on an Easter weekend, and I saw the report about the price of eggs. Well, the price of eggs are up mainly because of bird flu, because of some of the things that have happened, and a president gets attached to that. But I think you start showing people what's been happened, the job creations, and to be very clear, none of those things, there's nothing that the former president can talk about that comes near to that. And I think as we start to see some of the inflationary pressures come down, we start to hear more talk about where it's at, folks will come home. Because, look, this is a choice. The world is struggling on all of this, but the choice is very clear. Democracy, protecting that democracy, the freedoms, the reproductive choices that can be made versus this just dystopian just weirdness that's coming out of Donald Trump every time he gives something. That is going to be the choice at the end of the day.
Well, there is, though, this liability that President Biden seems to have. There was an uncommitted vote in your state show on Super Tuesday, 19% of people voting uncommitted. Is the president doing enough to address this criticism coming from Democrats over his handling of the Israel-Hamas war?
Yeah, look, and Minnesotans are an independent people. We've elected independent governors, and I'm proud that our party can have this conversations. This is what campaigns are supposed to do, and I think so. I think you saw the UN resolution on a ceasefire. I think you see the president talking about a need to have a lasting two-state solution, the need to relieve the humanitarian crisis that's in Gaza, while also recognizing Israel's right to exist. So I think those folks were expressing a democratic frustration. That's healthy. But at the end of the day, they're certainly not going to go with Donald Trump. The question is, we need to make sure they're motivated enough to realize they need to come back, that they need to get back on the issue of what happens in the Middle East, but also what happens on reproductive rights, what happens on health care, what happens on environment. On all of those things, those are folks that are with President Biden. So, yeah, I think they're doing it, and I think it's healthy, and I think those people have every right to express their frustrations. But at the end of the day, they will come home, and that will help make the difference.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know you wanted to be at the event, but we appreciate you being here on Meet the Press Now.
Thanks for having me.
And joining me now on set is Mariana Sotomayor, congressional reporter for The Washington Post, former New York Democratic Congressman Joe Crowley, and Mark Short, former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence and an NBC News contributor. So, Mariana, I want to start with you. Right now, of course, President Biden seems to have the cash and the infrastructure. He's at an advantage there, but former President Trump, he's leading in the polls, even though, again, it's in the margin of errors, but he has a cash disadvantage. So who's in the better place here, you think?
Yeah, I mean, the cash disadvantage is a real one, and this is how stark it is. In just this fundraiser alone, Biden campaign is expected to make $25 million. The Trump campaign raised only $20 million in February. So that is pretty significant in and of itself. And, you know, what the governor was saying is true, that if you have money, you are able to open campaign offices. The Biden campaign is expected to open, I think, at least 100 around the country using some of this money in the very near future, things like that. And, you know, something that is kind of stark for Republican donors is the fact that the Trump campaign with the RNC just changed the rules a little bit to make sure that a number of donations go towards the Save America PAC, which supports Trump. And that PAC has been paying some of his legal fees. So, I mean, it is still early. Yes, things can change. There is definitely, in terms of the polls, serious concerns for Biden that Trump is able to, you know, gin up his base. But at least when it comes to right now, that financial picture is telling us some things.
And Mark, what is this financial picture telling us, in your opinion? Is former President Trump's campaign healthy right now?
I think it's struggling to raise money, but I think it's also exaggerated in the press in many cases. As you mentioned before, Hillary Clinton outraised Donald Trump as well. He's going to run a smaller personnel campaign. He doesn't suffer from the ability to attract media attention. And so I think that the traditional campaign is not what Donald Trump's going to run. It's not what he ran in 2016 or 2020. And so I think that we make too much a deal of this. I think a much bigger issue is, will there be third, fourth, or fifth candidate on the ballot? Will Robert F. Kennedy be on the ballots? Will there be a no labels candidate? Because Donald Trump's support is so intense in both sides, polarizing, that it's going to stay, it's going to have a high floor. But if you have the non-Trump vote that's split among multiple candidates, that hurts Joe Biden. I think that's the bigger issue than the money issue.
Well, Joe, I want to ask you, of course, there is that big money issue in terms of how much money Democrats are going to be raising today. But I wonder about the united front part of this, the idea that you have these three presidents that are coming out. That I can't even imagine a moment where you would have George Bush on the same stage as former President Trump. So what does it mean, just from a messaging point of view, that these Democratic presidents can come together like this?
Well, I think especially looking at former President Obama getting out of the car with Biden is speaking to a particular audience as well. I think it does show tremendous unity, with the goal being not to have Donald Trump reelected. And I'll just go back, and we talk about history. Go back to 1864. Abraham Lincoln thought he was going to lose the election, you know, in his reelect. And this is going to be one of the longest campaigns ever. 200 some odd days still to go between now and Election Day. A lot's going to happen. I think money does make a difference to a degree. I think Mark's right that, and I had my own campaign where I outspent my opponent, and we know what happened. But to have that infrastructure in place is critical for such a national campaign, and that's where I think the difference is going to be.
We've been talking about the sort of advantages of President Biden being on stage with these presidents, but there is also the disadvantage, which is that both of them, both President Obama and President Clinton, they were younger than their opponents, and they both won re-election against people who were older than them. Is there a risk here for President Biden putting on display the fact that he is the oldest person in the room here?
I mean, yes, there is that physical contrast, but I do think, you know, bringing Obama in particular, he has always just ginned up the Democratic base and younger voters, which is just a group of people that Biden definitely needs to bring back into the party, get them enthused to be a reliable turnout base. So, yes, physically we will likely see that difference, but I mean, people are still going. They want to go see him and are tuning in online, too, to watch this fundraiser. So,
and there might be a podcast. I want to also turn to, of course, the other person in this race. Trump is also in New York. He's in Long Island, Mark, at this wake for New York for the NYPD. He is talking about crime, even though crime is down in a number of ways. Is this as big an event as maybe a campaign rally for Donald Trump? Can he capitalize on this issue of crime while not holding maybe a big rally about the issue in the same way?
I think so. I think this today actually is a favorable contrast for Donald Trump. I accept the point of having three presidents on the stage with a lot of stars, but for the average voter, they're seeing Donald Trump at a funeral for a slain officer. And I accept your point that the statistics show crime is down in some areas, but for many perceptions for Americans, it's still high. And I think it's a huge advantage for Donald Trump. And it's one, candidly, Yamiche, that could have been a vulnerability. The reality is that, he partnered with many Democrats in passing jailbreak legislation. He also, I think, has attacked, officers that were attacked on January 6th and defended the rioters as patriots. And so I think it could have been a vulnerability. But the optics of him being there with the family of the slain soldier, who was arrested 22 times before killing an officer, is a stark contrast to what Joe Biden is doing tonight. And I think that favors Donald Trump significantly.
But, Mike, is there also a risk that it could be seen as hypocritical? Because obviously former President Trump is dealing with his own legal issues here.
Well, I share with you what I think are the hypocrisies of, in many cases, he partnered in legislation that I think let many criminals out. He also has attacked or has defended those who attacked police officers on January 6th. So I think there is a challenge there. But the optics, I think, are starkly different. And I think it favors Donald Trump today.
I have to have my New York up a little bit here. And as the grandson and the son of New York City police officers, my dad served for 22 years on the NYPD, was a detective. The notion or idea that Donald Trump cares at all for this officer or this officer's family is outrageous. He has not an ounce of sympathy in his body. It is hypocritical. I think people look at it as hypocritical, that he's using this grieving family for political purposes, for a political rally. It's outrageous. Where was that same empathy for the families of police officers and others who passed away as a result of the 1/6 attack? It didn't exist. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. And New Yorkers are sophisticated enough to know that. I hope America is more sophisticated to understand he's exploiting a grieving family.
It's interesting to bring this up because, Mariana, Republican voters haven't held this against Donald Trump. What do you think?
Yeah, and, from my perch on Capitol Hill, House Republicans have talked about, defending the police. They make that an issue, especially in the House majority when they're able to pass certain bills declaring that. But at the same time, you have this party that is very used to also saying we need to defund the FBI. We need to defund the DOJ. Right. Other types of law enforcement officials, which Democrats are now trying to point that contrast out. Okay, you say that we want to defund the police. Well, you all also want to defund a different kind of police. Right.
Yeah. I want to ask you really quickly on the Congressman before we go. There's the third party and the no labels. Mm-hmm. Right now, they're having a lot of problems recruiting a candidate. Is that possibly just done, or are they not going to be able to get that off the ground, you think?
I'm not going to run on the third party line. I'm not. If not, I haven't been asked. But by the way, if they do ask, I'm not running. But look, it looks like they're running out of time. It's not easy to put together a campaign, to raise the resources, to do the things they want to do. And, I think we know who the two candidates are going to be.
Yeah.
It's over.
Yeah.
Well, but I think there's a third candidate, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I think that hurts Joe Biden significantly.
But it's a primary right now. He's not on the November election.
Well, we are seeing him show up in polls, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Mariana, Joe, Mark. Thank you all for being here. And coming up, an emotional day in Baltimore marked by a moment of silence for those killed in Tuesday's devastating bridge collapse. We're live from Camden Yards with the latest on the investigation and the response next. Plus, we have new developments from Capitol Hill. House Speaker Johnson now says he will send articles of impeachment against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas to the Senate on April 10th. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We're getting more information from investigators about the disastrous crash that brought down the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And today, the people of Baltimore paused to honor the victims. The Baltimore Orioles kicked off their 2024 season about an hour ago. The team started with a moment of silence for those who died less than 10 miles from Camden Yards in Tuesday's bridge collapse. Yesterday, 2 bodies were recovered from the Patapsco River, but authorities have called off the search for the 4 remaining victims. They have shifted to what they're now calling a salvage operation. Meanwhile, the NTSB has released this video of its investigators who have now been on board the ship and have spoken with the crew members. NBC News correspondent Ryan Nobles joins me now from Baltimore. So, Ryan, what have NTSB investigators determined in the past 36 hours? What's the latest?
Yamisha, before we talk about that, I just want to tell you about a pretty emotional moment that took place behind me here at Camden Yard, where the Baltimore Orioles are opening the 2024 baseball season. And in between the third inning, in the half inning, in the third inning, 3 Maryland Department of Transportation officers were honored for their bravery. They were part of that group of officers that alerted the folks that were driving in and around the Key Bridge to not get on the bridge, to shut down traffic in that area, and to save lives. And while they thanked everyone for all of the recognition that they've been given, they said, quote, in a statement, that no amount of training could have prepared anyone for the events that took place on the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And of course, even though there was a lot of heroic action that took place, and there were many lives that were saved, there were still 6 lives lost. And as you rightly point out, 2 of those bodies have been recovered. The search continues for the 4 others. In terms of the NTSB investigation, it is a lengthy process. They've been able to get on board the shipping container that is still in the middle of the Patapsco River. They've recovered that data recorder box that's been allowed them to at least start to begin to piece together the timeline of events. But one thing they have discovered while on board that boat is that it does contain hazardous materials, which is just going to continue to complicate the reclamation process there in the river before they can get the harbor back open. Yamish?
And Ryan, you talked about the fact that this is going to be a lengthy investigation. Do we have any idea how long it might last?
Well, the way that officials are framing it is to look at it in stages. The entire investigation could theoretically take years. It could take a long period of time before they actually close and shut down all the work that's going to go into finding out what went wrong. But they do expect over certain periods of time to learn new information. For instance, why this boat lost control. Why did it lose power? What led to that? That's something that they could discover in the next couple of weeks or months. But in terms of why the ship came down, or I'm sorry, why the bridge came down so quickly, what could be done to prevent that going forward, they're not really putting a specific timeline on that. They want to make sure that they do everything they possibly can to figure out everything they possibly can about this tragedy.
As we take in really this tragedy still, where there's also the fact that the ship is still in the middle of the river. What have authorities said about how long that ship might still be there and what it will take to move it?
Yeah, Yamish, I think with each passing day, that task becomes more daunting. When those investigators got on the ship, they realized just how much damage was done to the ship itself. And so there's 2 parts of this process. They've got to get the remnants of the bridge off of the ship, and then they need to begin the very careful process of removing the ship from the harbor. That's not going to be easy because, as we mentioned before, there are those hazardous materials on board. There's also the safety of the crew members who are also still on board at this point. So that they're also measuring in weeks. They really believe that there needs to be a sense of urgency connected to this because this harbor is such an important port in terms of the United States economy and, of course, the jobs that are associated with it. But they want to make sure that they do it safely because it is going to be a very delicate and in many ways unprecedented process. This is something that the folks dealing with this have never had to deal with before. Yamish.
Ryan, it's still just so hard to see those images, and you've been doing such a great job covering this story, so thanks so much for being with us. Joining me now is Alan Deal, a former investigator for the NTSB. Now, thank you so much for being here. Based on your experience, what would investigators be focused on at this point? What do you think is really happening here?
Well, there's probably several types of investigations underway simultaneously. The first question is, why did the engine fail? And how much did the engine crew, the people down in the engine room, the diesels don't fail suddenly normally, did this crew communicate with the captain? Because obviously, if he knew that engine might fail, he probably would have said to the pilots, hey, look, let's keep the tugboats handy because the engine room's telling me we've got some issues there. That would have greatly reduced the dangers. Of course, they were facing a crosswind. If you look at the smoke, you've seen the video, the smoke didn't go up straight. It went off to the side. There was a wind from the north, which blew the ship to the south, basically. And I can envision, this was not unlike the Titanic situation, where you've got this monstrous mega ship, in that case, heading for an iceberg. When you lose your power, your rudder loses its effectiveness. And you've got to remember, these ships have a lot of area. The cargo and the ship is like a big sail that's pushing the ship literally out of the channel. So they dropped an anchor. The pilot ordered that. He ordered hard left rudder, I understand, but he could not arrest the momentum. So the communication between the engine room, the captain, the pilots, and the tugboats are going to be critical. And there's a type of training that they're supposed to have called crew resource management. I think that'll be one of the big focuses of the board in this inquiry.
And Alan, you bring up the idea that there were tugboats and that there's been a lot of conversation of whether or not they should have been used further here. I want to play for you sound of the head of the NTSB. Take a listen.
Tugs help the vessel leave the dock, leave the port, and then get into the main ship channel, and then they leave. Once it's on its way, it's a straight shot through the channel. So there are no tugs with the vessel at that time. So they were calling for tugs.
So what do you make of what she's saying there? Could tugboats really have prevented this tragedy?
Well, that's what the NTSB will have to determine. Now, what Chair Humley was describing is the normal situation. If they think they've got engine problems, I don't think that pilot is going to allow that ship to proceed towards the bridge, because he's basically controlling the vessel in the harbor. So I think he would insist that the tug stay with them until we resolve whether or not we've got an engine problem.
I also want to ask you about this ship's black box. It's called the boat's voyage data recorder. What would you be most interested in, and what will investigators possibly be most interested in when they look at that box?
Well, it's kind of a combination of both voice and data recorders, but as Chairman Humley pointed out, it doesn't have many channels. It's not like an aircraft recorder with 1,000 parameters. The most important thing I would think, other than the voice, we talked about whether or not the captain was informed. We've got an engine problem. But the other thing is the velocity of the wind. Some of these voyage data recorders actually have a wind measuring device that feeds the data to the black box. And I didn't hear her mention that. But like I said, when I saw that smoke blowing horizontally instead of straight up, I thought, oh boy, he's in a strong crosswind. It's a high-profile vehicle. We all know what happens to trucks on the road when they get in a crosswind. The same thing happens in even a bigger way with these high-profile vessels.
Well, thank you so much for providing your expertise. We really appreciate it, Alan.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Up next, remembering the life and legacy of former Senator, vice presidential candidate, and frequent Meet the Press guest, Joe Lieberman. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Mark your calendar. Today, Speaker Mike Johnson announced that he will transmit the House's articles impeaching Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on April 10th. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says senators will be sworn in as jurors the next day. Johnson announced the decision in a signed letter by the 11 impeachment managers, including Georgia's Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is actively threatening the speaker's job. This impeachment trial will look much different than the presidential impeachment trials we saw during the Trump administration. And depending on what the Senate Democrats do, this could all be very, very short. We also got some news on the other impeachment inquiry. House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer is formally inviting President Biden to testify publicly, suggesting April 16th as a potential date. A lot happening at NBC News' Sahil Kapoor is on the Capitol Hill with the latest. So what can we expect specifically from the Mayorkas impeachment trial? What might that look like?
A lot of potential impeachments going on right now, Yamiche. On the Mayorkas impeachment, the House is finally going to transmit those articles after voting to impeach the DHS secretary on April 10th. As you pointed out, the next day, Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader's office, said senators will be sworn in for that trial. We know the impeachment managers include 11 members, including a couple of committee chairs, including Mark Green, the Homeland Security chair, as well as some far-right allies of Trump like Andy Biggs and Marjorie Taylor Greene. The parameters of this trial are very much unknown at this time. It's up to senators in terms of how to draw this out, whether it's going to be a full-blown extended trial with evidence submitted and senators considering all this stuff, or whether they might vote to dismiss it early. This is a possibility. It's something that the Republican Senator Rand Paul tried to do in the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. It fell short of getting the votes to dismiss, but Democrats control the Senate. They have 51 votes. If all those 51 members vote to dismiss, then this could be dispensed with very quickly, very early. And there's some signs of hope, for Democrats that might happen, because Senator Joe Manchin, the most conservative member of that Democratic caucus, told me a couple of weeks ago that he finds the Mayorkas impeachment ridiculous, and he would vote to dismiss if that were to come up before.
And Zahel, of course, there's also the other impeachment inquiry, the one, of course, against President Biden. Right now, it looks like Republicans might be preparing to end this whole inquiry with a whimper. How is that looking? And could you explain what's happening there?
Yeah, what's happening basically, Yamiche, is that Republicans don't have the votes right now to impeach President Biden. This is proving to be a much heavier lift than was the impeachment of Alejandro Mayorkas, which was not easy. They squeaked that through after failing the first time around. But James Comer, the House Oversight Chair, who's one of the leaders of this impeachment inquiry, has been hinting recently at a potential off-ramp from actually voting to impeach Biden. Republicans are not going to bring this up if they don't have the votes. It would be futile. It would be an embarrassment to them. And what Comer has been saying in fundraising emails to supporters is that Democrats would block this anyway, even if the House does vote to impeach President Biden, that Democrats would do what they've signaled they'll do with Mayorkas, which is kill it on the Senate front. And Comer has instead hinted at the possibility of instead issuing criminal referrals. He's explicitly said that he hopes Donald Trump gets elected president this fall, and that he appoints leaders to the Justice Department who would act on those criminal referrals and prosecute members of what he calls the Biden crime family. It's extremely unusual to see prominent American officials say they hope one person is going to get elected so he can prosecute specific people, but that's where we are right now, Yamiche.
That is where we are all. So thank you so much, Sahil Kapoor.
Thank you.
We want to now take a moment to remember someone who was a fixture on Capitol Hill for many, many years. Former Senator Joe Lieberman, who represented Connecticut for 24 years, first as a Democrat, then as an independent. Senator Lieberman died yesterday in New York. A statement from his family said his death was due to complications from a fall. In 2000, as Al Gore's running mate, Lieberman became the first Jewish American on a major party presidential ticket.
Our opponents are decent and they are likable men. I'm proud to call many in their party my friends, but America must understand there are very real differences between us in this election. Tonight, I believe the next frontier isn't just in front of us, but inside of us. To overcome the differences that are still between us, to break down the barriers that remain, and to help every American claim the possibilities of their own God-given lives.
As a Democrat, Lieberman was also willing to buck his party at times. He famously criticized President Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and later he was a vocal supporter of the Iraq War. He was also known for forging friendships across the aisle, most notably with Republican Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham. They jokingly called themselves the Three Amigos. 8 years after accepting the vice presidential nomination at the DNC, Lieberman spoke at the Republican National Convention shortly after, endorsing the GOP candidate, John McCain.
What, after all, is a Democrat like me doing at a Republican convention like this? Well, I'll tell you what. I'm here to support John McCain because country matters more than party. I am here tonight for a simple reason. John McCain is the best choice to bring our country together and lead America forward.
Joe Lieberman was a frequent guest on Meet the Press, appearing more than 24 times on the Sunday show. Here's part of his appearance from December 1996.
The biggest challenge is to regenerate America morally, and part of the immorality is the suffering that poor people endure. I'm optimistic at this time, and the very fact that more people are worried about the moral future of our country than the economic future tells me that the American people understand that we really don't live by bread alone, that even if we have more bread than most people around the world do, you still have to find the difference between good and evil and truth and falsehood and live according to that. I have a sense that there's a moral revival going on in this country.
Recently, Lieberman became a co-chair of the group No Labels, the group working to find a challenger to President Biden and former President Donald Trump in November. The group released a statement that reads, in part, Senator Lieberman was a singular figure in American political life who always put his country before party. He was a deeply principled and pragmatic leader who believed public service was a privilege and who dedicated his life to the betterment of others. Joe Lieberman was 82 years old. Welcome back. Today, disgraced crypto mogul Sam Bankman-Fried was sentenced to 25 years in prison. That puts an end to months of legal drama surrounding one of the biggest financial fraud crimes in history. A jury found Bankman-Fried guilty of 7 criminal fraud counts following a months-long trial last fall after his cryptocurrency firm FTX collapsed and went bankrupt in 2022. The company lost billions of dollars of customer money. Joining me now is CNBC technology reporter Kate Rooney. Thanks for being here, Kate. What did we hear from Judge Kaplan on his reasoning behind this sentence, and was it longer than expected?
Yamiche, yeah, great to see you. Well, it was kind of right in line with what a lot of legal experts did expect. 25 years to 35 years was sort of the range that folks were expecting. The maximum sentence was 110 years, roughly. So significantly less than even what the prosecution had recommended, which was 40 to 50 years. Bankman-Fried, meanwhile, had suggested 5 to 6 years, or at least his defense team did. So kind of right in the middle there. As far as what we heard from the judge today, the reasoning behind that sentencing, for one, he found that Bankman-Fried perjured himself on the stand. The judge thought that he lied on the stand, which adds to the sentence. And that was really one of the big gambles of him testifying in the first place. So came back to haunt him when it came to the sentencing. Also said that beyond not being trustworthy and perjuring himself, he said it was a risk that he would commit other crimes, and thought that the sentence needed to be long enough to ensure that he wasn't going to go out and do something like this again. Prosecutors called this one of the largest financial frauds in U.S. history. So those were the two main themes, and said in his 30 years on the stand, he hadn't seen anything like what he called a performance of Sam Bankman-Fried in terms of how evasive he was during cross-examination and a lot of the lying that went on.
And as you said, this is going to be remembered as one of the biggest financial fraud cases in history. What message do you think this sentencing sends?
That's really what the prosecution was trying to hammer home today, was that they're trying to send a message with this sentencing, this case in general, that things like this won't be tolerated, especially in newer technology industries like cryptocurrency, where it can be confusing. You can really get into the weeds on some of the investments, and it can sound confusing, but they said this was a good old-fashioned case of financial fraud, and they're trying to be clear that no matter what wrapper this, your financial instrument might be in, whether it's stocks or crypto or anything out there, they're saying fraud is fraud, and they're going to be tough on it. So that really was the message here.
Well, thank you so much, Kate, for breaking this all down. And still to come, Bibi backtracks details on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's push to reschedule an Israeli delegation's meetings in Washington. The latest reporting next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The White House says it is working to reschedule an Israeli delegation's visit to Washington to discuss Israel's planned offensive in Rafah. Earlier this week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu abruptly canceled the visit after the U.S. abstained from a UN vote calling for an immediate ceasefire, allowing it to pass. In a meeting with a bipartisan group of U.S. lawmakers in Jerusalem yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu downplayed concerns over an offensive.
Victory is within reach. It's a few weeks away. Now we are told, this is it, last point. Now we are told, you can't do this. If you go into Rafah, you're going to have a humanitarian catastrophe. You're going to have, 30,000, all of the Gaza Strip north of Rafah. People move down, they can move back up. They don't have to go into north of Wadi Gaza, but there's still 65% of the Gaza Strip left open. And people just move. They move with their tents.
Those comments come as President Biden continues to face domestic pressure over his handling over the war. As the president is holding that fundraiser we talked about at Radio City, about 50 protesters braved the elements in nearby Bryant Park. And yesterday, a State Department official resigned in protest, citing U.S. diplomatic and military support for Israel. We'll have more from the White House in just a moment. We begin on the ground with NBC's Rafah Sanchez in Israel.
Just days after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu very publicly canceled a trip to Washington by a delegation of senior Israeli officials, he is now quietly trying to reschedule those meetings. Those talks were supposed to be about this very public disagreement between Israel and the United States over Israeli plans to launch a major ground offensive in the city of Rafah. Netanyahu says that is the only way to destroy Hamas, but the Biden administration has been very clear. It believes any attack on Rafah in a large-scale manner would be a disaster, would lead to major civilian casualties, and to the disruption of humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza. Now, whether American officials at this rescheduled meeting will be able to change Israeli minds remains unclear. The U.S. believes Israel can achieve its goals in a more targeted, more surgical set of strikes on Rafah, but every indication from the Israeli side is they are determined to go in. Now, amid this public feud between the White House and the Netanyahu government, a new poll from Gallup shows that 55% of Americans disapprove of Israel's military operation in Gaza. That is the first time this poll has found a majority of Americans disapproving. And it comes amid what is an increasingly public set of strains in the U.S.-Israel relationship. While all eyes are on Gaza, there was more fighting over the Israel-Lebanon border over the last couple of days. Israel striking what it said was a senior operative in a militant group aligned with Hezbollah. Hezbollah firing back, killing a civilian in a town in northern Israel yesterday. And among the many concerns among Israeli officials is that this one-front war right now in Gaza could spread to a second front up in Lebanon. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Rafah Sanchez, for that report. Again, joining me now outside the White House is NBC's Monica Alba. Thank you so much for being here. So, Monica, the U.S. says Israel has agreed to reschedule talks on Gaza after calling it off just a few days ago. So why is Israel backtracking now? And how much is this Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, trying to feel out how far he can push the U.S.?
It really feels, Yamish, like this is sort of the all-time low in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, which has already become quite strained. But the U.S. has been very clear, and the Biden administration has said it continues to stand by Israel. There hasn't been any kind of a conditioning of aid, no shift in major policy when it comes to the war in Gaza. But now the U.S. is being a little bit more blunt with its rhetoric, and it is saying that it was the prime minister who canceled this meeting that was supposed to take place this week, trying to pin it on that UN resolution and the U.S. abstention, when really they claim that was sort of a political move that really disregarded this larger need to have the meeting, that now the prime minister's office is saying, okay, we will work to find a new date. And I'm told that's likely going to be sometime next week. And what it really signals here is that the U.S. doesn't believe that Israel is preparing to go into Rafah imminently, that there is some time here, and that they haven't been able to observe any imminent military movement on the ground. So they still believe there's an opportunity to have a conversation here. But the big question, Yamish, is what happens if ultimately Israel does defy the U.S. and the president? And could that perhaps lead to any kind of a shift in policy here? And that is what everybody is waiting to see. Now, if this meeting actually takes place next week, that will give us a little bit of a window into it. But also it may mean that that's just delaying, buying a little bit more time so that Israel can figure out whether they are going to go into Rafah, while there's still this major other question of whether there could potentially be some kind of a breakthrough that would lead to a temporary ceasefire and a hostage deal, since that's a major priority as well.
And how much is the Biden administration, they're stepping up, it seems, their criticism of Israel, really about dealing with the domestic pressure that they're facing and the backlash over President Biden's handling of the war in the Middle East?
It's certainly a factor in all of this, but this is also President Biden's approach from a foreign policy perspective. He has felt that this is the right way to handle it for months now, nearly 6 months since those terrorist attacks of October 7th. The president really believes that the way to try to influence Israel and its decisions is by keeping them very close and by embracing the prime minister. But we know that they have had very intense conversations on the phone in recent weeks, and that relationship has its own pain points as well. And so now the U.S. is still trying to use all these other sort of soft power approaches to try to really emphasize its position on all of this. And that's, again, what everybody is watching for, to see if that ever shifts. But the U.S. has also been clear, Yamiche, in recent weeks, raising these concerns about the humanitarian crisis in particular, saying that something absolutely needs to be done on that front. And that is what a potential ceasefire could deliver.
Well, definitely a lot to watch. We'll be continuing to look for your reporting. Thank you so much, Monica. We're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.